At 8:21 a.m. on October 14, 1943, 291 B-17 flying fortresses turned toward Schweinfurt, Germany, while their fighter escorts prepared to turn back in less than an hour. The bombers were heading for the ball-bearing factories that kept the German war machine running. Without fighter escort for the final 400 miles, they would face the full fury of the Luftwaffe alone. The escort fighters were P-47 Thunderbolts, the best the 8th Air Force had. They could protect the bombers for exactly 175 miles before fuel forced them home. After that, the B-17s would be on their own. This had happened before. 2 months earlier, on August 17th, 60 bombers had been shot down in a single day. The week before, on October 8th, 30 bombers were lost over Bremen. The crews called these missions suicide runs. 10 men flew in each B-17. Most never made it to their 25th mission. The problem was not courage. American bomber crews were flying into hell every day, facing fighters, flak, and temperatures that dropped to -40 degrees. The problem was not the bombers themselves. The B-17 was tough, heavily armed with 1350 caliber machine guns. The problem was distance. Germany's vital targets lay deep inside the Reich, 800 miles from England. No American fighter could fly that far and fight when it got there. The P-47 had a combat radius of 175 miles. The P-38 Lightning could stretch to 300 miles with drop tanks. But Berlin was 580 miles away. The Ruhr Valley was 400 miles. Every mile beyond fighter escort range meant more bombers shot down, more crews killed or captured. The United States Army Air Forces had spent years believing bombers could defend themselves. The doctrine said massed formations of B-17s, bristling with machine guns, would create such devastating fields of fire that enemy fighters could not get through. This theory was written by men who had never seen a Focke-Wulf 190 diving at 400 miles per hour, cannons blazing. It was written before anyone understood what happened when 100 German fighters attacked 40 bombers with no escort. On October 14th, the P-47 escorts turned back near Aachen, their fuel exhausted. The bombers flew on alone. What happened next would go down in history as Black Thursday. Of the 291 bombers that launched that morning, 60 were shot down. 600 men were killed or captured in 5 hours. Another 17 bombers returned with damage so severe they had to be scrapped. 121 more were damaged but repairable. The 8th Air Force had lost over 20% of its attacking force in a single mission. At that loss rate, the entire bomber force would be destroyed in 5 missions. Strategic bombing was failing. The war effort was in crisis. And sitting in a filing cabinet at Wright Field in Ohio was a report about a fighter plane the Army Air Forces had been ignoring for 2 years, a plane that could have prevented Black Thursday entirely. The fighter was called the P-51 Mustang, and the story of how it was ignored, rejected, and nearly thrown away before becoming the most important fighter of World War II begins not with American generals or Pentagon officials, but with a British purchasing commission and a company president who made a promise no one thought he could keep. In January 1940, James Howard Kindleberger was president of North American Aviation, a company that had never built a fighter plane. He manufactured trainers, the AT-6 Texan that taught pilots how to fly. His company was good at making training aircraft, reliable at meeting contracts, but fighters were different. Fighters required advanced engineering, cutting-edge aerodynamics, engines that could produce maximum power at altitude. North American Aviation had none of that experience. But when Sir Henry Self of the British Purchasing Commission walked into Kindleberger's office in January 1940, he was not looking for innovation. He wanted Kindleberger to build Curtiss P-40 fighters under license. Britain needed planes immediately. France had fallen. The Battle of Britain was coming. The Royal Air Force was desperate for anything that could fly and fight. The P-40 was not a great airplane. It was adequate. It could fight at low altitude but struggled above 15,000 feet. Its Allison engine lacked supercharging for high-altitude performance. But Britain needed numbers, not perfection. Kindleberger listened to Self's proposition and made a counteroffer that seemed insane. He said North American could design and build a completely new fighter that would be better than the P-40. He could do it in 120 days, from blank paper to flying prototype in 4 months. Self thought Kindleberger was either lying or delusional. No one could design and build a new fighter that fast. The British Purchasing Commission gave him 120 days to prove it. If he failed, they would take their money elsewhere. What Self did not know was that North American's chief designer, Edgar Schmued, had been sketching a revolutionary fighter design for months. Schmued was a German immigrant who had come to America in 1931. He was self-taught, brilliant, obsessed with aerodynamic efficiency. Born in 1899 in Hornbach, Germany, Schmued had served as an aircraft mechanic in World War I with the Austro-Hungarian aviation troops. After the war, he worked for Fokker in Brazil before immigrating to the United States. He joined North American Aviation in 1936 after a brief stint with Belanca. Schmued had a unique design philosophy. He believed that every component of an aircraft should serve multiple purposes. A structural member should also be an aerodynamic surface. A cooling duct should also produce thrust. A fuel tank should also be a structural element. This philosophy of integrated design would make the Mustang the most efficient fighter of World War II. For 2 years, Schmued had been working on an idea for a fighter with laminar flow wings, a new concept that could reduce drag by 20%. He had studied the mistakes of existing fighters, the P-40, the P-39, the early Spitfires. He knew exactly what was wrong with them and how to fix it. The P-40's radiator hung below the fuselage, creating enormous drag. The P-39's engine was mounted behind the pilot, causing balance problems. The Spitfire's elliptical wings were beautiful but difficult to manufacture. Schmued would avoid all these mistakes. When Kindleberger promised the British a new fighter, Schmued already had the design in his head. He just needed to build it. The challenge was not just technical but organizational. North American had never built a fighter. The company's engineers were experienced with trainers and bombers, not high-performance combat aircraft. Schmued had to train his team while designing the plane, teaching them the principles of fighter design while racing against the 120-day deadline. Schmued assembled a team of engineers: Raymond Rice, Larry Waite, Ed Hawkey, Art Chester. Rice handled structural design, creating the innovative multi-section fuselage that could be assembled quickly. Waite managed systems integration, ensuring that hydraulics, electronics and controls worked together seamlessly. Hawkey calculated the aerodynamics, spending 18-hour days with a slide rule verifying that Schmued's intuitive designs would actually work. Chester designed the power plant installation, figuring out how to mount the Allison engine for perfect balance and cooling. They worked 18-hour days, 7 days a week. They ate at their desks, slept in the factory. While Britain fought for survival and France collapsed, 5 men in California raced to create a fighter from nothing. The pressure was enormous. If they failed, Britain might lose the war. If they succeeded, they would create something that had never existed before. A fighter that could be mass-produced like a car, but perform like a thoroughbred. The design they produced was unlike anything flying. The wings used laminar flow airfoils developed with NASA's predecessor, NACA. These wings maintained smooth airflow much longer than conventional wings, reducing drag dramatically. The cooling system for the engine was revolutionary. Instead of draggy external radiators, Schmued buried the radiator in the fuselage behind the pilot. The heated air exiting the radiator would actually produce thrust, turning waste heat into propulsion. Every surface was mathematically calculated for minimum drag. The fuselage was created using conic sections, a technique that produced perfectly smooth surfaces. The plane was designed for mass production, with the airframe divided into 5 major sections that could be built separately and assembled quickly. 78,000 man-hours later, on September 9, 1940, the prototype rolled out of the hangar. They had beaten the deadline by 18 days. The NA-73X, as it was designated, was beautiful. Even sitting still, it looked fast. The problem was it had no engine. Allison was late delivering the V-1710. On October 26, 1940, test pilot Vance Breeze took off in the NA-73X for its first flight. The plane exceeded every performance target. It reached 390 miles per hour, faster than any American fighter in production. It was stable, responsive, easy to fly. The British were impressed enough to immediately order 320 aircraft. They named it the Mustang. The early testing revealed both the Mustang's promise and its limitations. The laminar flow wing worked exactly as Schmued had predicted, maintaining smooth airflow at speeds that caused other fighters to buffet and shake. The radiator scoop, which many critics had said would cause excessive drag, actually produced a small amount of thrust as Schmued had calculated. The heated air exiting the radiator created what would later be called the Meredith effect, named after the British engineer who had theorised it but never successfully implemented it. But there were problems. The Allison engine, excellent at low altitude, wheezed and gasped above 15,000 feet. Its single-stage supercharger simply could not compress enough air at high altitude. While a Spitfire could fight effectively at 25,000 feet, the Mustang struggled above 15,000. The British found a solution. Use the Mustang for low-altitude tactical reconnaissance and ground attack, missions where its speed and range were more important than altitude performance. The first Mustangs reached Britain in October 1941. No. 26 Squadron at Gatwick was the first to receive them. The pilots were sceptical at first. The Mustang looked different from British fighters. Its nose was longer, its cockpit was set further back, its wings were straighter. It did not look like a fighter. It looked like a racing plane. But when they flew it, their scepticism vanished. Squadron leader Geoffrey Page reported, "It was like stepping from a cart horse to a thoroughbred." The speed, the acceleration, the stability, everything about it was superior. The RAF immediately put Mustangs to work on rhubarb missions, low-level sweeps over occupied France. Flying at 50 feet above the English Channel to avoid German radar, Mustang pilots would cross the French coast at maximum speed, strafe German airfields, attack trains, shoot up truck convoys, then race home before German fighters could intercept them. These missions were dangerous but effective. They forced the Germans to maintain fighter defences across the entire coast, diluting their strength. On May 10, 1942, Flying Officer Hollis Hills of No. 414 Squadron became the first Mustang pilot to shoot down a German aircraft, a Focke-Wulf 190 over France. By August, RAF Mustangs had claimed 20 German aircraft destroyed, but these were minor successes compared to what was coming. The real potential of the Mustang remained locked behind the limitations of its Allison engine. But the United States Army Air Forces was not interested. When 2 examples were delivered to Wright Field in 1941 for evaluation, they sat on the ramp for months, with only 1 hour of test flight logged. The Army Air Forces was committed to other fighters. Republic was building the P-47. Lockheed had the P-38. Bell was producing P-39s. Curtiss was still making P-40s. The Mustang was seen as a British project, built for foreign money, irrelevant to American needs. The evaluation report, when it was finally written, acknowledged the plane's excellent low-altitude performance, but criticised its high-altitude limitations due to the Allison engine's single-stage supercharger. The resistance at Wright Field was both institutional and personal. Major General Oliver Eccles, Chief of the Material Division, had already committed the Army Air Forces to the P-47 as its primary fighter. Eccles controlled procurement for the entire Army Air Forces. His word determined what planes were built, what engines were developed, what weapons were deployed. He saw the Mustang as a distraction from established programs. The P-47 was American-designed, American-powered, American-built. The Mustang was tainted by its British origins. Wright Field's test pilots filed lukewarm reports about the Mustang. They complained about the cockpit layout, the gun arrangement, the fuel system. They found fault with everything except the plane's actual performance, which was superior to every American fighter then in production. One test pilot wrote that the Mustang handled like a truck compared to the P-40. This was technically true at very low speeds, but irrelevant in combat where speed and acceleration mattered more than slow-speed handling. The bureaucratic resistance extended beyond Wright Field. General Henry Arnold, commanding general of the Army Air Forces, initially showed no interest in the Mustang. He was focused on heavy bombers, believing that strategic bombing would win the war. Fighters were seen as defensive weapons, necessary but not decisive. Arnold's staff reflected his priorities. They allocated resources to bomber production, bomber bases, bomber crews. Fighters got what was left over. Even when the British demonstrated the Mustang's potential, American officials remained skeptical. In July 1942, the RAF used Mustangs for the first long-range reconnaissance mission over Germany. Flying from England to Cologne and back, a distance of 800 miles, the Mustangs photographed German installations and returned without loss. The mission proved the Mustang's range capability. Wright Field's response was to order more reconnaissance versions, not fighters. The Army Air Forces ordered no Mustangs for combat. Instead, they ordered 500 modified as dive bombers, designated A-36 Apache. Another 310 were ordered as reconnaissance aircraft. But as a fighter, the plane that would eventually save the bomber offensive was ignored. The Mustang went to war with the Royal Air Force, while the United States Army Air Forces continued losing bombers at catastrophic rates. The man who would change everything was not a general or a Pentagon official. Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Hitchcock, Jr. was 41 years old, too old for combat flying, but he had connections that reached to the highest levels of power. In World War I, at age 17, he had joined the Lafayette Flying Corps, scored 3 victories, been shot down, captured, and escaped from a German prisoner of war camp by jumping from a moving train and walking 100 miles to Switzerland. Between the wars, he became one of the world's greatest polo players and a successful investment banker. When World War II began, Hitchcock volunteered for combat, but was rejected for being over age. Instead, through his friend John Wynant, the American ambassador to Britain, he became assistant air attaché at the embassy in London. It was supposed to be a desk job. Hitchcock turned it into a one-man crusade to revolutionize American fighter aviation. In April 1942, Ronald Harker, a test pilot for Rolls-Royce, flew a Mustang for the first time. He was astonished by its performance at low altitude, its range, its handling. But above 15,000 feet, the Allison engine wheezed and struggled. Harker had an idea that seemed obvious in retrospect, but revolutionary at the time. Put a Rolls-Royce Merlin engine in the Mustang. The Merlin had a 2-stage supercharger that maintained power to 30,000 feet. It powered the Spitfire and Lancaster bomber. If it could be fitted to the Mustang, it would create the ultimate fighter. Rolls-Royce began converting 5 Mustangs to Merlin power in June 1942. The first flew in October. The results were spectacular. The Merlin-powered Mustang reached 440 miles per hour at 30,000 feet, 100 miles per hour faster than the Allison version at that altitude. It could climb to 20,000 feet in 6 minutes. It had the range to fly to Berlin and back. When Hitchcock saw the test results, he knew immediately what they meant. This was the plane that could save the bomber offensive. This was the fighter that could win the air war. But when he reported the results to Washington, the Army Air Forces was not interested. The Mustang was still seen as a British project. The United States had already committed to the P-47 and P-38. Pentagon officials did not want to disrupt production for an unproven hybrid design. Hitchcock was stunned by the rejection. American bombers were being slaughtered for want of escort fighters, and the solution was sitting right in front of them. The military bureaucracy could not see past its own prejudices and institutional inertia. Wright Field, the Army Air Force's testing center, was committed to American designs with American engines. The Mustang with a British engine was considered almost traitorous. Major General Oliver Echols, chief of the Material Command at Wright Field, had already decided the P-47 would be the primary Army Air Force's fighter. He controlled procurement. His word was law. But Hitchcock had not survived a German prison camp and walked across Switzerland to give up now. If official channels would not work, he would go around them. He began what his biographer called a guerrilla campaign to force the Army Air Forces to accept the Merlin Mustang. He flooded Washington with performance data. He invited influential friends to watch flight demonstrations. He hosted dinner parties where he cornered generals and undersecretaries. He wrote directly to General Henry Arnold, commanding general of the Army Air Forces, bypassing the entire chain of command. Arnold initially dismissed Hitchcock's appeals. The Army Air Forces had invested too much in existing fighters to change course. But Hitchcock had one advantage. He knew Robert Lovett, the Assistant Secretary of War for Air. Lovett and Hitchcock had flown together in World War I. When Hitchcock flew to Washington in November 1942, he went straight to Lovett's office. He brought the test data from Britain, photographs of the Merlin Mustang, performance charts showing its superiority to every American fighter. Lovett understood immediately. He had been watching the bomber loss rates. He knew the strategic bombing campaign was failing without long-range escort. Lovett confronted Arnold directly. The bomber losses were unsustainable. The 8th Air Force was being bled white. Either they found a long-range escort fighter, or the daylight bombing campaign would have to be abandoned. Arnold, under pressure from above and below, finally relented. In November 1942, he ordered 2,200 P-51 Mustangs with Packard-built Merlin engines. North American Aviation would produce them at Inglewood, California, and a new plant in Dallas, Texas. But ordering the planes and getting them into combat were two different things. Production did not begin until June 1943. The first P-51B did not reach England until November 1943. By then, the 8th Air Force had lost over 1,000 bombers. 10,000 men were dead or captured. The delay had cost lives that could have been saved. The technical challenges of producing the Merlin Mustang were enormous. The Packard Motor Company had to retool its Detroit factories to build the Merlin engine under license. Every component had to be converted from British to American measurements. Every specification had to be translated from British to American standards. Packard engineers discovered that Rolls-Royce craftsmen hand-fitted many parts during assembly, adjusting each engine individually for optimal performance. This was impossible in mass production. Packard had to redesign components for interchangeability while maintaining the engine's performance. The first Packard Merlin, designated V1650, came off the production line in August 1942. It produced 1,490 horsepower at takeoff and maintained power to 30,000 feet. When installed in the Mustang airframe, it transformed the aircraft's performance. The top speed increased from 390 miles per hour to 441 miles per hour. The service ceiling rose from 31,000 feet to 42,000 feet. More importantly, the Mustang could now fight effectively at the altitudes where bomber formations flew. North American Aviation faced its own production challenges. The company's Inglewood, California plant was already at capacity building B-25 Mitchell bombers. To produce Mustangs in quantity, North American had to build an entirely new factory in Dallas, Texas. Construction began in April 1943. The first Dallas-built Mustang, designated P-51C to distinguish it from the California-built P-51B, rolled off the assembly line in August 1943. The two models were identical except for their production location. Meanwhile, the 8th Air Force was bleeding. In the summer and fall of 1943, bomber losses reached catastrophic levels. The raid on Schweinfurt-Regensburg on August 17th cost 60 bombers. The Bremen raid on October 8th lost 30 bombers. Munster on October 10th lost another 30. Bomber crews were calculating their odds of survival with grim mathematics. At current loss rates, a crew had a 1 in 4 chance of completing their 25-mission tour. Morale was collapsing. Some crews were refusing to fly. The strategic bombing campaign was on the verge of failure. The 354th Fighter Group was the first unit to receive Merlin-powered Mustangs. They were based at Boxted, Essex. The pilots had been flying P-39s, a mediocre fighter that was nicknamed the Flying Coffin. When they saw their new P-51Bs, they could not believe the difference. The acceleration was incredible. It climbed like a rocket. At 25,000 feet, where the P-39 could barely function, the Mustang was just getting started. The first escort mission with P-51 Mustangs was flown on December 5, 1943, to Amiens, France. It was a short mission, well within P-47 range, intended to test the new fighters. They performed flawlessly. On December 13th, Mustangs escorted bombers to Kiel, Germany, 400 miles from base. For the first time, American fighters were providing protection deep into German airspace. On December 20th, Mustangs flew to Bremen. On January 7, 1944, they escorted bombers to Ludwigshafen, 500 miles from England. The impact was immediate and dramatic. In October 1943, before Mustangs arrived, the 8th Air Force lost 9.1% of bombers that attacked their targets. In January 1944, with limited Mustang escort, losses dropped to 6.3%. By February, with more Mustangs arriving, losses fell to 3.5%. The bomber crews called the Mustangs their little friends. For the first time since the bombing campaign began, they had protection all the way to the target and back. The Mustang pilots quickly developed tactics to maximize their effectiveness. Instead of staying close to the bomber formations, they ranged ahead and to the sides, hunting German fighters before they could attack. Colonel Donald Blakesley of the 4th Fighter Group pioneered these aggressive tactics. He told his pilots to forget about defensive flying, attack everything, chase the Germans to their airfields, shoot them down while landing, make them afraid to take off. The results were devastating for the Luftwaffe. Major James Howard of the 354th Fighter Group single-handedly defended an entire bomber formation on January 11, 1944. Alone, separated from his squadron, Howard attacked 30 German fighters. He shot down 4, probably destroyed 2 more, and damaged 2 others. For 30 minutes, he was the only fighter defending the bombers. He received the Medal of Honor for his actions. Captain Don Gentile of the 4th Fighter Group became known as Ace of Aces. Flying his Mustang named Shangri-La, Gentile shot down 21.8 German aircraft in air combat and destroyed 6 more on the ground. His wingman, Lieutenant John Godfrey, shot down 18 aircraft. Together they formed the most successful fighter team in the 8th Air Force. General Dwight Eisenhower called Gentile a one-man air force. Major George Preddy of the 352nd Fighter Group achieved the highest score of any Mustang pilot. On August 6, 1944, Preddy shot down 6 Messerschmitt 109s in a single mission. Despite suffering from a hangover from a party the night before, Preddy led his squadron against a formation of 30 German fighters attacking bombers over Hamburg. In minutes of combat, Preddy destroyed 6 enemy aircraft, saving dozens of bombers. He would eventually shoot down 26.83 German aircraft before being killed by American anti-aircraft fire on Christmas Day, 1944, a tragic case of friendly fire. But the real revolution came on March 4, 1944. On that date, the first American fighters appeared over Berlin. 68 Mustangs escorted 660 B-17 and B-24 bombers to the German capital. The psychological impact on both sides was enormous. Hermann Göring, head of the Luftwaffe, later said, When I saw Mustangs over Berlin, I knew the war was lost. The technical reasons for the Mustang's superiority were straightforward. With internal fuel and drop tanks, it could fly 1,300 miles. The P-47, even with maximum external fuel, could only manage 600 miles. The Mustang could cruise at 325 miles per hour, while using less fuel than a P-47 used at 250 miles per hour. At 25,000 feet, the Mustang was 50 miles per hour faster than a P-47 and 70 miles per hour faster than a Messerschmitt Bf 109. More importantly, the Mustang changed the entire nature of the air war. Previously, American fighters had been defensive, protecting bombers from attack. The Mustang was offensive. After escorting bombers to their targets, Mustangs would drop to low altitude and strafe German airfields, destroying planes on the ground. They would hunt German fighters trying to land, catching them when they were low on fuel and ammunition. They would patrol German training areas, shooting down instructors and students before they could become operational pilots. By April 1944, the Luftwaffe was losing more planes than it could replace. More critically, it was losing experienced pilots faster than it could train new ones. In April and May 1944, the Luftwaffe lost 800 fighters and 600 pilots. The Mustang was not just protecting bombers, it was destroying the Luftwaffe's ability to fight. The German pilots who survived these encounters spoke with a mixture of respect and fear about the Mustang. Major Wilhelm Guth of Jagdgeschwader 26 recalled, "We could no longer predict where the American fighters would be. They were everywhere. Above us, behind us, waiting at our airfields. The Mustang had the range to follow us anywhere. We had lost control of our own airspace." Lieutenant General Adolf Galland, commander of German fighter forces, understood the implications immediately. The Mustang was not just another fighter. It was a strategic weapon that neutralized Germany's geographic advantage. For 3 years, the heart of Germany had been protected by distance. Allied fighters could not reach Berlin, Munich, or the vital industrial areas of the Ruhr. German factories could produce weapons in relative safety. German training bases could prepare new pilots without interference. The Mustang destroyed that sanctuary. Galland tried to adapt German tactics to counter the Mustang threat. He ordered pilots to avoid combat unless they had numerical superiority. He concentrated fighters around key targets, hoping to overwhelm the escorts with mass attacks. He developed new formations designed to break through fighter screens. Nothing worked. The Mustangs were too fast, too numerous, too aggressive. They hunted in packs, covering each other, never giving German pilots an opening. The technological response was equally futile. Germany rushed development of jet fighters, the Messerschmitt 262 and Arado 234. These aircraft were faster than Mustangs in level flight, but they were unreliable, short-ranged and vulnerable during takeoff and landing. Mustang pilots quickly learned to patrol German jet bases, catching the jets at their most vulnerable moments. Lieutenant Urban Drew of the 361st Fighter Group shot down 2 Messerschmitt 262 jets in a single mission on October 7, 1944, proving that even Germany's wonder weapons were not immune to the Mustang. The production battle was even more one-sided. In 1944, North American Aviation produced 5,700 Mustangs. Germany produced 2,800 fighters of all types. The mathematical reality was inescapable. For every German fighter destroyed, America could produce 2 replacements. For every German pilot killed, America had 3 ready to take his place. The Luftwaffe was not just losing the air war, it was being systematically annihilated. German pilots developed a gallows humour about their situation. They joked that the Luftwaffe's new mission was to provide target practice for American fighters. They called themselves the Suicide Squadron because their life expectancy was measured in weeks, sometimes days. New pilots arriving from training were called lambs because everyone knew they would be slaughtered. The few veterans who survived became increasingly fatalistic. They flew because it was their duty, not because they believed they could win. By June 6, 1944, when Allied forces landed at Normandy, the Luftwaffe could only manage 300 sorties over the invasion beaches. The Allies flew 14,600 sorties the same day. The air superiority that made D-Day possible had been won by the Mustang. The statistics tell the story. In 1943, before Mustangs arrived, American fighters claimed a ratio of 1 German fighter shot down for every 1.2 American fighters lost. By early 1944, with Mustangs operating in numbers, the ratio changed to 4 German fighters shot down for every Mustang lost. By the end of the war, Mustang pilots had destroyed 4,950 enemy aircraft in aerial combat and 4,131 on the ground. The ground attack missions were particularly devastating. After escorting bombers to their targets, Mustangs would drop to treetop level and hunt targets of opportunity. They destroyed locomotives, stopping German supply trains. They strafed truck convoys, preventing reinforcements from reaching the front. They attacked airfields, destroying planes before they could take off. On a single mission on April 16, 1944, Mustangs destroyed 135 German aircraft on the ground. The impact on German pilot training was catastrophic. Before the Mustang arrived, new Luftwaffe pilots received 200 hours of flight training before entering combat. By early 1944, that had been reduced to 100 hours. By the summer of 1944, new pilots were being sent into combat with less than 50 hours of flight time. They were not pilots. They were victims waiting to be shot down. Veteran German ace Günther Rohl, who survived the war with 275 victories, described the situation. "We were sending children to their deaths, boys who could barely fly, let alone fight. They would take off in the morning and be dead by noon. The Mustangs were waiting for them, experienced pilots in superior aircraft. It was not combat, it was execution." The fuel situation made things worse. Germany was running out of aviation gasoline. Pilot training was curtailed to save fuel for combat operations. But combat operations were burning pilots faster than they could be replaced. It was a death spiral. Fewer pilots meant more losses. More losses meant fewer instructors. Fewer instructors meant worse training. Worse training meant more losses. By December 1944, the Luftwaffe was launching suicide attacks. Sonderkommando Elbe pilots were ordered to ram American bombers, sacrificing themselves and their aircraft to destroy a single bomber. It was desperation born of impotence. The mighty Luftwaffe that had terrorized Europe was reduced to kamikaze tactics. Even these desperate measures failed. Mustang escorts shot down most of the ramming fighters before they could reach the bombers. But the man most responsible for the Mustang's success would not live to see victory. On April 18, 1944, Thomas Hitchcock was testing a P-51 at Salisbury, England, when his plane crashed. He was killed instantly. The official report indicated he was unable to pull out of a dive during testing, suggesting he might have been pushing the aircraft to its limits, still fighting to improve it, still refusing to accept anything less than perfection. Edgar Schmued, the designer who created the Mustang, received no official recognition during the war. His name appeared in no reports. He was never decorated or promoted. After the war, he continued designing aircraft for North American, creating the F-86 Sabre jet that would dominate in Korea. When asked about the Mustang years later, Schmued said, "We just built what they asked for. The British asked for a good airplane. We gave them one. The institutional resistance that nearly killed the Mustang was never officially acknowledged. The Army Air Force's history of World War II mentions only that the Mustang was developed for the British and later adopted by American forces. There is no mention of the 2-year delay, the bureaucratic opposition, the fact that Wright Field ignored the plane while bombers were being slaughtered. General Oliver Eccles, who had opposed the Mustang, was promoted and decorated. He retired as a major general, his reputation intact. But the pilots who flew the missions knew the truth. Colonel Donald Blakesley, commander of the 4th Fighter Group, said after the war, "The Mustang won the air war over Europe. Without it, the invasion would have been impossible. The bombers could not have continued. We would have lost." Captain Robert Goebel of the 31st Fighter Group was more direct. "The brass nearly killed us all by ignoring the Mustang. Thank God for the British and Tommy Hitchcock. They saved our asses." The broader lesson of the Mustang was not about technology, but about institutional blindness. The United States Army Air Forces had built an entire doctrine around self-defending bombers. When that doctrine failed catastrophically, the institution could not admit its error. It took an outsider, Hitchcock, operating outside normal channels, to force change. It took a foreign power, Britain, to recognize the Mustang's potential when its own country would not. It took unnecessary losses, thousands of deaths that could have been prevented, before reality overwhelmed bureaucracy. The cost of this institutional failure was measured in lives. Between October 1943, when bomber losses peaked, and March 1944, when Mustangs began escorting in numbers, approximately 2,000 American airmen were killed or captured in missions that Mustang escort could have protected. These were not statistics. They were young men with families, dreams, futures that were cut short because bureaucrats at Wright Field could not see past their prejudices. Each B-17 carried 10 men, a pilot and co-pilot, barely out of flight school, a bombardier who had trained for months to drop bombs accurately from 25,000 feet, a navigator who could find a target through clouds and flak using only a compass and stopwatch, 6 gunners, most of them teenagers, who manned the 50 caliber machine guns that were supposed to protect the bomber, but could not. When a B-17 went down, 10 families received telegrams, 10 mothers cried, 10 sets of dreams died over Germany. North American Aviation built 15,586 Mustangs during the war. They served in every theatre, with every Allied air force. After the war, they continued flying in Korea, during the Israeli War of Independence, and in dozens of other conflicts. The last military Mustangs were retired by the Dominican Air Force in 1984. Today, about 300 Mustangs still exist, with half still flying. They are preserved not as weapons, but as reminders of what almost was not. In the Pacific Theatre, Mustangs arrived late, but proved equally dominant. Based on Iwo Jima, Mustangs escorted B-29 superfortresses to Japan, a round trip of 1,500 miles. They shot down Japanese fighters, strafed airfields, attacked shipping. On April 7, 1945, Mustangs shot down 21 Japanese aircraft without loss. The Japanese, like the Germans before them, found their airspace had become a hunting ground for American fighters. The very long-range missions over the Pacific pushed the Mustang to its limits. Pilots flew 7-hour missions, sitting in cramped cockpits, managing fuel consumption with obsessive precision. 1 gallon too much burned on the outbound leg meant ditching in the ocean on the way home. Navigation had to be perfect. A 1-degree error over 1,500 miles of ocean meant missing the tiny island of Iwo Jima entirely. Yet they did it, day after day, extending American air power to the Japanese homeland. When the Korean War began in 1950, the Mustang was supposedly obsolete. Jets had taken over the fighter role, but the F-80 Shooting Star jets lacked range and loiter time for close air support. The Mustang, now designated F-51, was recalled to service. Flying from rough airstrips in Korea, Mustangs provided close air support for United Nations ground forces. They could carry rockets, bombs, and napalm, loiter over the battlefield for hours, and put ordnance precisely where needed. The Mustang's last combat missions were flown by the South African Air Force in Korea in January 1953. It was a fitting end. The plane that had been ignored, rejected, and nearly discarded had outlasted its critics and competitors. It had served longer, flown farther, and destroyed more enemies than any other American fighter of its generation. The Mustang succeeded not because of the system, but in spite of it. It survived bureaucratic hostility, institutional prejudice, and willful blindness. It became the greatest fighter of World War II, not because American military leadership recognized its value, but because a German immigrant designer created something revolutionary. A British commission was desperate enough to fund it, and a polo-playing former fighter pilot refused to accept no for an answer. In 1943, General Adolf Galland, commander of German fighter forces, was asked by Hermann Göring what he needed to win the air war. Galland replied, "Give me Mustangs." He was being sarcastic, but he was also acknowledging a simple truth. The Mustang was not just the best American fighter or the best Allied fighter. It was the best fighter, period, and it almost never happened at all. The most telling statistic is not the number of German planes shot down or the number of bombers saved. It is this. Between October 1943 and May 1944, the period when Mustangs were arriving in theatre, the loss rate for 8th Air Force bombers dropped from 9.1% to 2.7%. That difference, 6.4%, represented hundreds of bombers and thousands of lives. Those were men who came home because the Mustang finally arrived. They were men who would have died if the bureaucracy had gotten its way. James Howard Kindleberger died in 1962. At his funeral, dozens of former bomber pilots attended. They were not there because he ran an aircraft company. They were there because his plane had saved their lives. One of them, former B-17 pilot William Lawley, a Medal of Honor recipient, said at the service, "Every time I see a Mustang, I think of the friends who made it home because that plane was there. And I think of the friends who did not make it home because it came too late." The P-51 Mustang changed the air war over Europe. It made the invasion of Normandy possible. It saved countless Allied lives. But its greatest achievement was not what it did, but what it represented, the triumph of innovation over bureaucracy, of performance over politics, of results over regulations. It was proof that sometimes the best weapon is the one the system does not want. Sometimes the most important victories are won not on the battlefield, but in the conference rooms and corridors where decisions are made or avoided, where planes are ordered or ignored, where wars are won or lost before they are ever fought. If you found this story compelling, please take a moment to like this video. It helps us share more forgotten stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold histories. Each one matters. Each one deserves to be remembered. And we would love to hear from you. Leave a comment below telling us where you are watching from. Our community spans from Texas to Tasmania, from veterans to history enthusiasts. You are part of something special here. Thank you for watching and thank you for keeping these stories alive.